Is the world more divided than ever over Israel? While some call its attack on Gaza a genocide, others insist the onslaught is a necessary act of self-defense. As this brutal war continues, can the international community find consensus to make it stop? Or are we destined to see more innocent civilians lose their lives? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is The Newsmakers. Diplomats, businesses, activists, and ordinary citizens have been taking increasingly vocal positions on the Gaza-Israel conflict. But hearing their polar opposite views could make you wonder if we're actually talking about the same war. In some cases, those defending Palestinians have been accused of anti-Semitism and even lost their jobs. But in the U.S., some Jewish Americans are now protesting in support of Palestine. In fact, they temporarily shut down New York's Grand Central Station to condemn Israeli actions and U.S. support for Israel.
We are here to protest the genocide that is happening in our name. It has to stop. We are crying every minute.
Please, these are not Jewish values. It is not a Jewish value to be dropping bombs on children, killing children and their families.
And on Tuesday, the director of the New York office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights resigned, saying a genocide in Gaza is unfolding before our eyes, and the UN appears powerless to stop it. No surprise the UN is powerless, given several European countries even voted against a resolution for a humanitarian ceasefire. Here's a closer look now at the global divisions over the Israel-Gaza conflict.
Stop supporting the genocide and ethnic cleansing of the people of Gaza!
An increasingly familiar call, with hundreds of thousands of protesters in cities around the world, walking and chanting in support of the civilians in Gaza. This time, they echoed through the halls of the U.S. Capitol, where the U.S. Secretary of State was trying to testify before a Senate committee requesting a large funding package to support Israel. Blinken sat silently after protesters repeatedly interrupted him.
Save the children of Gaza!
More than 8,500 Palestinians have been killed in the past 3 weeks since Hamas launched a series of attacks in Israel on October 7. And at least 3,500 of them were children. UNICEF warns the enclave is turning into a graveyard for children. Late on Tuesday, Israel flattened much of the Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza, killing between 50 and 100 civilians in pursuit of a single Hamas commander. And the international community is wholly divided. With the express of moral, financial, and material support of the US, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made it clear that Israel will not stop.
Just as the United States would not agree to a ceasefire after the bombing of Pearl Harbor or after the terrorist attack of 9/11, Israel will not agree to a cessation of hostilities with Hamas after the horrific attacks of October 7. Calls for a ceasefire are calls for Israel to surrender to Hamas, to surrender to terrorism, to surrender to barbarism. That will not happen.
But unlike during previous Israel-Palestine flare-ups, Washington finds itself more and more isolated in its stance. Only 12 countries joined the US and Israel in opposing a motion calling for a sustained humanitarian truce at the last UN General Assembly. EU nations have long been divided on the matter. While European leaders have strongly condemned Hamas attack, they still struggle to stick to the same message. Brussels' statement at the conclusion of last week's European Council summit took a distinctly softer line, calling for humanitarian corridors and emphasizing the importance of protecting civilian lives. In the Muslim world at large and among Palestine's near Arab neighbors, the mood is more clear-cut. On Saturday, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan held a huge pro-Palestine rally in Istanbul.
Elbette her ülkenin kendini
Of course, every country has the right to defend itself, but where is the justice? Where is justice? In Gaza, it's not defense, but a ruthless and clear genocide. They use the people of Gaza like a weapon. aiming to collectively destroy them through hunger, thirst, fuel shortages, and collapsing healthcare services.
Bir silah gibi kullandıkları
The obliteration of Jabalia refugee camp drew condemnation from Arab nations, many of which have put plans to normalize relations with Israel on ice. The Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation also denounced the attack. The UN, meanwhile, has been calling for restraint and humanitarian consideration since the beginning. In a conflict that will never likely to be resolved peacefully without international input, consensus seems further away than ever.
Now, Israel's occupation of Palestine has divided people for decades, but never has it culminated in the deaths of so many thousands of civilians, especially children, driving many to their emotional limits. So where could these diverging positions take this conflict, and where could inaction lead? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from Mannheim, Germany, Palestinian journalist Hebh Jamal, from Washington, author and visiting fellow at Georgetown University specializing in Arabic and Islamic studies, Seraje Assi. And from London is Christine Cheng. She's a senior lecturer in war studies at King's College London. Thanks all so much for being with me. Seraje, I'll start with you because I'd like to get your perspective from the U.S. because it's really become the country most symbolic, I think, of the huge divisions in opinion. The U.S. still provides massive amounts of military aid to Israel, which is now being used in Gaza. But there now seems to be some growing momentum against that, even from the American Jewish community. Tell us what you've seen.
Of course, we have all seen the inspiring side of Jewish students and activists marching in support for Palestine and Gaza and demanding a ceasefire. So the tide is shifting against Israel. Israel no longer enjoys popular support among widespread popular support among the Jewish community in the United States, especially among young Jews. And these young Jews actually believe that Israel no longer represents them, and Israel's actions in Gaza, in fact, they condemn Israel's actions and war crimes and apartheid regime and massacres of children in Gaza. However, U.S. politicians are turning a blind eye to the popular rage in the streets and on campuses. Just recently, the U.S. Senate has passed a unanimous resolution condemning anti-Israel student activities on college campuses, which is clearly meant to sanction, silence, and punish Palestinian voices in the U.S.
You know,
and this is not.
And also, one of the angles I raised briefly in the introduction is the fact that the people there in the U.S. feel their actual jobs are at risk if they share an opinion on this conflict, you know, particularly one that defends Palestinians. What's been your observation from there as far as the business community is concerned? Because some have been rather vocal about their Israeli support and actually threatening certain members of their businesses should they come out in support of Palestine.
Well, this is not new. Even before Israel's war on Gaza broke out, some 35 states passed bills and executive orders criminalizing the boycotts of Israel with broad bipartisan support, which is quite ironic because here in the U.S. you can boycott any American corporation or firm, but you can't boycott an Israeli firm or an Israeli product. And the U.S. has a long tradition of boycotts. Now, fear-mongering against Palestinians is soaring. Also, if you look at the media coverage and the political rhetoric, they have been fueling anti-Palestinian sentiments, demonizing and dehumanizing Arabs and Muslims in America, which brings to mind the post-9/11 climate. Now, also there have been hate crimes, including the shocking killing of a 6-year-old boy in Chicago, and most recently, a Muslim woman in Texas. So the space for Palestinian voices is shrinking. And Palestinian rights groups also are being banned, including most recently in Florida, Students for Justice in Palestine.
Okay.
So there is a rampant culture of anti-Palestinian McCarthyism in academia, and as I say, on campuses. against writers, activists, businessmen. People are getting fired. People are getting expelled and punished.
Okay, let me turn to Hebh, because I would like to get on your perspective from Europe and from Germany in particular. How has it felt in Germany, which has a very particular history with Israel, but also with a significant Muslim population as well, as it's supposed to be a traditionally pacifist human rights approach to conflict post-World War II. But still, Hebh, in this conflict, have you felt Germany taking sides? Is it manifest on the streets?
I think taking sides is definitely an understatement when it comes to this government. I mean, we have to also take into consideration in 2008, Germany classified Israel's national security as its reason of state. So as you could see, they've always clearly had a bias, clear pro-Israel bias. It is the curtailment of, Palestinian and pro-Palestinian civil rights in this country has reached a point that I am honestly, it's a little speechless when I try to describe it. The chancellor just announced that, a few weeks ago, not only has he banned pro-Palestinian organizations, the Berlin Senate has specifically stated that the kufiya and saying free Palestine in schools is now banned. And if violated, the teachers have a right to call the police on the children. These are minors. And he also specifically said that he wants to be able to deport dissidents and people who, quote unquote, support terrorism easier. So the curtailment of pro-Palestinian civil and human rights has reached a catastrophic point in this country. Protest after protest has been banned and met with extreme police violence. But still, people are going on the streets. People are still protesting despite the bans. You have to understand that Berlin, for example, and Germany is home to the largest Palestinian diaspora outside of the Middle East and South America. So people are making their voices heard, even though it is incredibly difficult. There is no media coverage that is including Palestinian voices, and if they are, they're extremely fringe. And that's just the unfortunate situation that we have here. And I would argue that it is even worse than places like the United States and UK.
It's interesting, Hebh, because we have heard so many references to a post-9/11 climate, and there's a certain level almost, I'll describe it as paranoia. I even heard a German friend say to me that she's scared that her sons, who are now teenagers, could be facing some kind of deployment in the military. I mean, that sounded very far-fetched to me. But I mean, tell me then, what are your worst fears? How bad do you really feel it could get?
Well, I think that recently, however, Germany has taken a tiny step back. Less protests have been banned over the course of this week. There was a huge one in Berlin last weekend, and there's another one this weekend. As far as I know, it is not banned. And slowly but surely, phrases such as humanitarian, rights for civilians in Gaza are being trickled into the media. So I feel that Germany is understanding that the world is against this, that the global south is against this. You have countries such as Bolivia that cut diplomatic ties with Israel. They cannot possibly support unconditionally the actions of the Israeli government and believe that the world will still see them as a leader of the European world, a democratic world, let's say.
Yeah. Christine, with you being in the UK, which many view as second to the US in support for Israel, you now actually have certain MPs, mainly conservative Crispin Blunt, warning the government that the UK is in legal peril, as he described it, because of its so-called unqualified support, he said, for Israel. Is that resonating there with the leadership at all? Or, I mean, if they don't care about Palestinians necessarily, will they fear their own potential prosecution in international courts? Or is this just an untouchable subject, really, given what the UK's position has been?
I think the UK's position has traditionally to be as close as possible to the United States because of the special relationship. And there are a whole variety of historical reasons for that. And it makes a lot of geostrategic sense for the UK to behave like this. Having said that, there is also a huge Muslim population here too. and there is also a large and important Jewish community as well, and the two are at odds with one another at the moment. And so I would say the country is divided in a way. Political leadership has a particular feeling about this, and both Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, and Rishi Sunak both agree and have provided and qualified support to Israel. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that the people within their parties completely agree. So I would say on both sides, both with the Conservatives and within Labour, there's division. And the third party in the UK, the Liberal Democrats, are sitting, I would say, recognizing and condemning what has happened to Hamas, and also calling for a humanitarian pause. So there's there's definitely more balance there. So, looking across the leadership of the UK, it looks split, and it also looks like, there's division within the parties.
Christine, I saw you nod your head when Seraje alluded to how students in certain universities in the United States are being treated. Speak to us about what's happening as well in the UK, because there's this question now that universities should actually be protecting their students and their right to free speech. We actually saw the faces of Harvard students displayed across those digital billboards for their association with the Palestinian solidarity groups at Harvard University. And they were labeled out and called out as anti-Semites. What is the responsibility now of universities like yours to actually take a position and protect their students? Not taking a position necessarily on the conflict itself, but allowing their students to engage in the kind of free speech that these democracies are supposed to protect?
So on my part, and I'm speaking just in a personal capacity here as an academic, I think it's very important for people to be able to express what they feel. That is the whole point of a university, to be able to have discussions about these sorts of issues in the most civilized way possible, and to be able to agree or disagree agreeably, even when you don't agree with one another on the most difficult of issues. If you can't talk about it in a university environment, then where can you talk about it, right? That's, I think, the question that I would pose, right? This is the one space where we are supposed to be able to talk things through and to have these sorts of debates. Shutting them down like this, I don't think it speaks well to what democracies are supposed to stand for.
Yeah. Seraje, you're on the same page there, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, in America, it's even more poignant because this is not an Israeli war. It's an Israeli-American war. And these students see their country supporting and arming Israel to the tip, providing billions in arms assistance and weapons to Israel. And they say, we refuse to be implicit in this war. We refuse to see our tax money goes to killing children in Gaza and to the apartheid system in the West Bank, to occupation. And, as a university professor, I find the whole thing ironic because students have marched against every American war so far, Vietnam, Iraq. But when it comes to Palestine, there is a free speech exception to Palestine somehow. And this is, in Germany quotes its Holocaust complex. In America, this is clearly the work of intensive lobbying done by AIPAC and other pro-Israel lobbying groups in the US. And you see this merciless campaign against students and academics and writers and artists and retaliations and threats to pro-Palestinian activists, including myself, shows you to what degree to what extent the United States has gone in this conflict, completely being on the side of Israel, throwing its full support behind Israel, even denying Palestinians the pretense of humanity. The U.S. has vetoed every UN proposal to call for a ceasefire, even a humanitarian ceasefire.
As did a number of European countries, as we mentioned. Sometimes it's just so difficult to wrap your head around that a humanitarian ceasefire, given the level of suffering, can actually be rejected by some of our world's leading democracies. But Hebh, let me come back to you and ask more specifically about the actual language that's being used, not just officially, but just on the streets. You know, lines are really being blurred, where we've been hearing people talk about pro-Hamas rallies, for example, making kind of a deliberate effort not to distinguish between ordinary Palestinian people and Hamas. How is that, do you feel like that's being called out now, or are people actually that aren't quite as well informed necessarily, are they getting confused because the distinction is being blurred so badly?
So I just want to paint you a picture. I believe it was a year or now 2 years now, Deutsche Welle fired 7 Palestinian Arab journalists who have specifically, expressed some sort of solidarity with the Palestinian people. Over the course of this month, the German national news network, ARD, specifically wrote guidelines for their journalists on how to speak about the conflict. And part of that is actually, telling their journalists that beware, a lot of Palestinians will be killed, but we have to still frame this as Hamas's fault. This is like exact language being instructed by journalists. It's not even an attempt to seem neutral. And I want to just kind of, push back a little on this concept of like, oh, are people, are people understanding that there's a difference? Is there pushback? We don't know. There's not even an opportunity for conversation here. There's no polls. Like we know that in America, 66% of Americans support a humanitarian ceasefire. They would never, a national news media here would never even conduct such a poll. So there is absolutely no way of knowing what the German public actually believes, about Israel, because the propaganda that is being spewed by the media is essentially 100% being dictated by Israel. Whatever they say is being broadcasted on every single national German news channel. And if a Palestinian civilian is killed, it is almost always done in the context of targeting Hamas military bases. And you will see that in every German newspaper, for example. If a site in, for example, in Jabalia refugee camp, over 400 people were killed yesterday. It was labeled in German media as targeting Hamas bases, and so is the nation divided? Are regular Germans actually questioning the situation? We have no idea.
Hebh, do you think the U.S., the UK, and Germany care about what their legacy might be in this conflict? And if they don't care now, do you think they will care in the future if they see these kinds of massacres continue with their implicit support?
So I want to for a second speak also as a Palestinian who has family in Gaza. Essentially, my husband's whole extended family is currently there, facing bombardment every single day. And just to kind of, put a human perspective on this, the estimated amount of people dead in Gaza, murdered, massacred, is reaching or has reached, the level of the Bosnian genocide, right? And the whole world essentially sees that as something that was horrific and something that needs to be condemned and studied and researched to ensure that it is never done again. Never again is now. And in the future, just as we see the Iraq war as something that was absolutely atrocious, we will see what is happening in Gaza as something that should have been unjustifiable. And they all study the reactions of Germany and the United States and the UK of how they supported the genocide of my family and the Palestinian people that live there.
Well said. Christine, quick final question for you then. Is there any potential silver lining to this conflict and how it might turn opinion widely enough to somehow lay the groundwork for an actual peaceful resolution?
Yeah, I look to this really dark time and I think about what the window of opportunity for change. And I think one of the things that is happening is that people are actually paying attention to what is happening on the ground and really thinking more in a nuanced way about the whole situation. And that hasn't happened, I would say, for a good 20 years. Somehow this issue has fallen silent and not enough people have come out and spoken up about it. It's just been a conflict that has been simmering along the sidelines. And I think what might be possible coming out of this is that there will be a whole set of activists who are galvanized around this issue and will be incentivized to look at the historical roots of this conflict and to think more about what a long-term potential peace settlement might look like, hopefully revived in the form of the two-state solution that looks more viable, possibly with some form of international community involvement. I see the UN being invoked here as a possible some kind of protection force or peacekeeping force. I see discussions of international coalitions coming in. It feels unviable to me that Israel would come in and reoccupy Gaza. So the question is, what comes after?
Yeah, that will have to be the final word. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us, our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.